In the first part of this session, we'll cover the importance of research and understanding your audience. Most people who write for a living, well, they'll tell you that getting it right takes about 10% of actual writing time and about 90% research. Knowing what to write before you write it, and to whom, well, it might sound like an obvious place to start. But when you're under pressure to meet a business writing deadline, well, the obvious can go straight out the window. It really shouldn't, though, because even if you're up against the clock, the whole process of writing your content will become much easier if you just put the pen down, sit back from your keyboard, and just kind of consider things first. Remember all about that incubation process. An important first task, when you're planning a piece of writing work, is to think carefully about its purpose. Well, first start by identifying your reader, bearing in mind these three simple questions. Who is my reader? Will they read this? And what value is being created? If, for example, your brief is to write a 1,000-word business-to-consumer brochure on a new range of, motorized mobility scooters, the language, tone, and style of your piece, well, it shouldn't be targeted towards a youth audience, which sounds pretty obvious. But look in any newspaper, magazine, or at any website, and you'll soon find countless examples of advertisements for products, well, that seem to be incongruously addressing a completely irrelevant market. This accounts for the irritation or amusement you kind of feel when viewing a TV advert that's not aimed at you. When this happens, the audience feels disconnected straight away, and the intended message of the content falls between the cracks. It's one of the biggest reasons sales copy and adverts fail. In our example, after you've identified your main mobility scooter readership as pensioners or perhaps MS sufferers, then you have a very compelling reason why they'll want to read about your new products. But it is a competitive market, and the scooters won't sell themselves. So the next part of the process is to ask yourself, what's in it for my intended readers? What benefits will our products give these readers over and above those of our competitors? And how do I communicate this to them in a language that they'll appreciate? Which brings us back to our central mantra, always consider benefits, not just features. This is when the analysis stage of the research process really kicks in, when you go back to your product and set out all the features it offers your target reader, listing the corresponding benefits. Think about everything that your product can do and how this will actually help the reader, how this will create value for them within the content that you're about to write. If at this stage you need to clarify certain product features or specifications, or even identify more generalized subject matter that kind of reinforces your point, go onto the internet and Google your key topics. Read up on relevant details that'll put your claims into an authoritative context. Imagine yourself in the mindset of your target reader and search for examples of similar products that are directed at them. Note the language used to talk to them, and consider what works and what doesn't in terms of tone. The more detailed your research at this stage, the more rounded and effective your writing will be. You might think you're collecting superfluous details, but when it comes to actually writing your content, you'll find you're already kind of a mini expert on the subject and can cherry pick the best facts, statistics, and juiciest pieces of information to back up your message. The final stage of your research should take the form of collating your rough notes into a definitive structure. This structure will depend on the media in which your content will be produced. For example, writing for the web is very different than writing a sales letter or a brochure. But if your research is sound, you'll put yourself on a solid footing for actually structuring and writing effective content. So here's a kind of research shortlist, and we'll be going over all of these points in basically this part of the session. You are your client. You need to discover precisely what you or your client want to achieve. Another short list is the company or service itself, so you understand the ethos, the brand, and the voice. You need to research customers. After all, if you don't know who you're writing to, how will you know what to say? you need to research the product or service. Your readers have to understand every aspect of it to discover its main benefits. You also definitely need to research the competition. You need to know what else is out there and what makes that particular product or service you're writing about different. Okay, so let's get started with our session. On the screen, you'll see some aims and outcomes for session 3 of this unit. To highlight, you'll explore the process of creative thinking for innovation and conceiving big ideas for branding messages. You'll explore how to determine strategic marketing position, target demographics, media vehicles, and translating these into creative copy. And you'll also develop your knowledge of fundamental brand writing skills. It doesn't strictly fit into any list of general rules, but it's always worth remembering that time is vital to producing copy for a living, and excellence in general. There's never enough time to raise standards for the logical reason that people set deadlines based on my past experience. However, it does follow that if you want to do things better than you did in the past, you might meet some resistance on timing. So whenever a deadline presents itself, always push the apparent time allowed. Is that deadline for real? Or would it magically increase if it turned out that your work wasn't good enough? Some people have the natural talent to turn out satisfactory copy in a few minutes, but this can sometimes be as much a liability as an actual asset. Satisfactory brand copy, no matter how quickly it's produced, is not in and of itself a valuable commodity. All branded copy is, in a way, an extension of the product or service it actually represents. In fact, in some areas like internet brands, it's the only visible manifestation of the product, so it's unwise to cramp its development. A great idea takes less than a second to occur, but which second it occurs in, it can't be known at the outset. Asking for, or just giving yourself, time is one of those things that seems counterintuitive. It often seems that whatever brand promotion task you're faced with achieving is about impressing people with your mental ability and your agility. It's about heroically solving problems quickly. But remember our points about lateral thinking and the incubation process covered previously. While it's arguably more impressive to score 9 out of 10 for a job completed in 5 minutes, especially if you're working for a brand, marketing, or advertising agency, copywriting is not a gymnastic event where you score marks for difficulty. You're better off using the time available properly to score 10 out of 10. Tony Anton says the same in his book, which is called The Great Print Advertising, in which he states, great branding demands not just high marks, like a 9.5 or a 9.7, it demands perfect marks, in other words, straight 10s. In the end, good branding makes everyone's job easier. It defines the essence of a company for staff and consumers alike, and at the same time, sells its products. So give yourself time to breathe. You need to ensure that your big idea and copy concept is demonstrably relevant, objective, right for the target market, and so on. In other words, that it's armor-plated. This is especially true if you work for an agency or you're a copywriting freelancer. Your quest will be to get past the echelons of creative directors, account directors, brand directors, marketing directors, and beyond in the international director sphere. Why are the golden rules arranged in the order shown on the screen? The main one is that for some reason, being told the golden rule of this or that kind of walk of life is a nice enough experience. But when you really think about it, it's usually of little practical help. It's difficult to sit in an office or a room with a blank pad or a blinking cursor on your computer and just, start being simple, or for that matter, ambitious. Golden rules, don't forget, are usually bestowed by someone looking backwards, having worked their way up through a design or media career, only then finding the mental space necessary to define the essence of it even to themselves. Advice, as Baz Luhrmann said, is a form of nostalgia. These are also usually people who have a gift for making a vast and complicated situation seem, well, simple. So passing on generalizations may inspire, or it may simply induce an admiration for the person doing the passing on. But it doesn't directly instruct. So for that reason, the 8.5 really, rules are kind of in a logical order for writers as they contemplate starting their writing work. Rather than thinking, what can I do that will generally be good? A question, let's face it, that's kind of unlikely to produce a fantastic idea by way of an answer. The first thing to do is just fill your head. Accurate, honest, and up-to-date information is where the finished product is invisibly roosting. This explains why the first two rules, know your market and do research, seem to have so little to do with being creative, talking as they do about investigating things and asking questions. We've spent some significant amount of time developing your understanding of audience in the branding unit. And we're not quite done with this topic just yet. We'll be delving more deeply into this topic, both audience profiles and consumer psychology, later on in this unit. Delving into Rule 3, answering the brief, may encourage the first stirrings of original thought, but this is immediately and satisfyingly crushed by the killjoys of Rules 4 and 5. Once the rules of relevance and objectivity have inspired the production of something worthwhile, the next two rules kindly point out the futility of being merely worthwhile. For the time being, though, it's back to the beginning. You're faced with a blank piece of paper or a blinking cursor and the need to fill your head. Okay, so what am I really talking about when I'm saying things like fill your head? Well, first, your first move when you get a brief, or when you're thinking about a brief for yourself, is probably not to think about your audience. It's far more likely that you will think rather abstractly about the situation that you're faced with. In other words, what it is you want to accomplish. Then you may continue to think rather abstractly, but no longer about the situation at hand. There's nothing wrong in this, of course. You're unlikely to start investigating the target market just because that's what everyone else tells you to do. Some hints and tips on the practicalities of getting down to work are undeniably useful, but they are well covered elsewhere. Whatever the brief, I would recommend leaving all pens, layout pads, PCs, tablets, and Macs alone for as long as possible and simply think, or better still, talk. So who are you talking to? The first subject to think or talk about is the target market. Who is your audience within that target market? The first goal is to visualize your audience sufficiently well enough to be able to address him or her in a very natural way. Remember Aardvark Records' profile for Jess? We knew all of the tribes we communicated with, and we knew them all very well. Go back and review those two Satyagraha advertisement examples. The language, tone, and imagery feel used in both of these examples was subtly different, directly speaking to two distinct tribes. So, if your target market is young people or teenagers, you may be tempted to think of them as a general mass of youth, possibly tainted with your own prejudices or predilections when you think about them. This may lead you to eventually to talk to them in a very generalized way, to use a youthful message kind of delivery system, such as the distressed type, shots of young people doing young things like skateboarding or being youthfully energetic, those ubiquitous, shiny, happy, smiling young people type shots. This may signal your intentions to speak to a certain group of people. This won't single you out from the other product messages in the same or similar areas who use exactly the same tactics and techniques. Really pinpoint the people you're talking to and nail this down. It's not just young people or ABC1 male mid-market. That's merely a requirement. And that's why I disparage the use of terms like consumers, customers, and demographics, and basically use them only when I have to. Know exactly who your target person is, down to what he or she wears, what he or she does in the evening. Bob Levinson, a writer who started at Doyle Dane Bernbacken back in 1959, said, males 18 to 34, or households above 30 pounds per annum, are categories that are worse than useless. They are actually destructive. If you have the time and the opportunity to do so, join some focus groups. You can find them in their area by searching for them on Google. Just search on a phrase like the name of the town or the city that you live in, plus area focus group. So for instance, it could be, London area marketing focus groups, and you should easily be able to find a list of them. Or for down here, you can do Cornish focus groups, or Liverpool focus groups, or Manchester focus groups, wherever you live in. You get the idea. Research groups of this kind are used to produce data and reports for product development teams and marketing professionals. They have their advocates, as well as their detractors. But putting that debate to one side, they are a gold mine for writers. Use them as a listening exercise. Chances are, sooner or later, you'll be sitting in a room with people who fit your audience profile. Listen to how they speak, down to the very word choices that they make. Listen to what they say. What are their likes and their dislikes? What are their touch points, their action points? What are their views of the world? What are their preferences, and what turns them off? Under the cover of being one of them, chat with them during coffee breaks. Get a sense of what they watch on telly and what they read. Are they largely single or dual income households? I promise you, use these opportunities well, and they will offer you a gold mine of information, and you didn't have to spend a penny to acquire this knowledge. You just had to give up some of your time, which you're typically paid for by the company running the focus group. The main reason for attending focus groups is the opportunity they offer to eyeball different target markets. As a human being, you're tuned into receiving signals and information about other human beings when you meet them. All of a sudden, the idea of addressing a group of teenagers and your own synthetic idea of teenage speak will automatically become slightly awkward. Just listen to how people are prepared to talk, quite naturally, about what they look for or what they hate about the product on offer. You'll get a natural feel for what they find funny, what they notice, their everyday terminology, and probably hundreds of subtle things that needn't go into a report, but will be somewhere useful in your brain when it comes to addressing the group in copywriting terms. Take the Economist advert on the screen. What's great about this work is that there's nothing false about it. A handful of text speaks directly and honestly to how the Economist's audience see themselves. This isn't just important for getting the information across. That could be achieved with almost any style of advertising, for the simple reason that those interested in geopolitics and geofinancial matters are hungry for this information. By showing an understanding of a target audience that's as centralist and left of center, the Economist can benefit from their trust later on. It's a very different style of ad from, say, the Financial Times, which has an overlap in audience with the Economist, but largely appeals to a completely different audience. For the Economist, the success of this apparently simple campaign is directly linked to what it knows about its own readership. They're intelligent, and they want to be successful. The copy talks only to those points, never to any of the magazine's fascinating subject matter. Rather than boasting about the Economist's writers, sales, articles, success in predicting events, it is content to identify with real accuracy the people it wants to talk to. This creates an intimacy with the product that is priceless and a binding, consistent relationship. When you narrow down the market in this way, you don't have to shout so loud or shout so generally. You're talking the same language as your audience, and you're guaranteed a hearing. It may seem odd to narrow your customer base when trying to make money. However, it makes sense if you're selling 300,000 units of a product and want to sell more, to talk intelligibly to the 3 million for whom that product is remotely appropriate, than the vaguely 60 million, including millions of children and retired people, who don't need it. If you think hard enough about your target market, award-winning copy just springs into your head. I'll use an example from my own practice. It's a psytrance act called Spore. Yes, I said psytrance, psychedelic trance in other words. I don't expect you to know what that is exactly. Let's just say it's a form of clubbing and rave music. Psychedelic offers a pretty strong clue. So does the name Spore. I just joined Aardvark Records and was tasked with relaunching Spore. I was already familiar with the electronic and dance music and the clubbing and raving scenes. So my first effort was a pretty healthy nod and a wink to the drug culture within psytrance. It worked, but it didn't work as well as it should have. It just didn't sell Spore's unique selling point, in an electronic music sea awash with copy, that touched on the same point in one way, shape, or form. Now, one of Spore's USP was the fact that it used live instruments and not just sounds and loops produced by a computer. Specifically, they used a didgeridoo. And every time they played live, the crowd would just simply go wild, not just for the music, but for the talent Mark had with that didgeridoo. So my second copy attempt featured the headline, "Blow Your Own Horn," with a big old picture of Mark on the didge, and added a hint at environmental and social concerns that were important to Spore. This approach worked a treat. This was the message that the global psytrance community wanted to hear about. It resonated with their concerns, and the whole "blow your own horn" resonated strongly and emotionally with their mantra of self-expression and individuality. It was an advert that transformed Spore into an international psytrance brand. Okay, so back to the topic at hand. Another benefit to knowing your audience is that creative work sourced from their worldview is almost always more enjoyable and less contrived to conception than that from the advertiser's point of view. Remember, we speak to them through our branding messages, not at them. It just makes more sense. Too many brands start out in the market with clunky launch campaigns. They're, obsessed with itself as a product, and it's obsessed with its ingredients. The successful brand or successful brands refined their view of who they're talking to. It is a conversation that is typically played out in slow motion and at some expense, as both seller and buyer get to know each other. Those brands that do survive to refine their message often do so by having a good product or service message in the first place. Brand messaging, when it's targeted properly, can skip preliminaries involved in a conversation. Rather than introduce yourself through half-effective brand messaging and await the response, why not pinpoint the appropriate audience from the off and have fully effective communication? In addition to the online resources I've already given in the branding unit and attending focus groups near your town or in the city that you live in, one of the other ways to get to know your prospective audience is to read the papers and magazines that they read, or to watch the programs that they watch. It's one of the more explicable coincidences in life that these will also tend to be the media in which you'll be advertising to them, if budgets actually allow. And how do I know what magazines they read or what TV shows they watch? The links on the screen provide a wealth of information that answers just this question, and actually quite a bit more. Many countries have the same information available for free online, so substitute UK with the country you need information and data for. So let's take a look at the media first. Of course, When considering the media, you have to be a little more selective in what you take out than when you're meeting your target audience face to face. What you see and read, say in a teen magazine, well, it tends to be a bit homogeneous. Well, actually, not a bit homogeneous, it's very homogeneous. The same is true of motoring magazines, computer magazines, lad magazines, gardening, The Economist, The Sun, the Financial Times, and so on. In each publication, almost everything in them, including the ads, well, they seem to conform to a tribal identity. It's important not to draw the wrong conclusions about how the medium should be used to your best advantage. Remember, the magazine or paper itself, it needs to keep strictly to its house style in order to maintain its own identity and reason for purchase. You should research the medium as an extension of the information loading process. In other words, having read the magazine, or the newspaper, or viewed the TV channel, this isn't the moment to start running off and writing ads. If we continue the metaphor of the tribe, you're not there to run around in the gang with everyone else, brandishing a spear and making similar noises. You're hoping to start a war cry that others adopt as their own. The term slogan is indeed derived from an unspellable Gaelic word meaning war cry. Background research into the technologically evolving media is something that needs to be ongoing, and it's hardly unpleasant, as it merely involves watching movies, surfing the net, and so on with a curious mind. So let's take a look at money. These days, if you can think it, you can show it. Unfortunately, there's no rule of thumb to say that if you can show it, your budget can actually afford it. There's nothing much worse than watching a spectacular effect, especially a special effect, done on the cheap, unless you're doing something tongue-in-cheek and making that explicitly clear. If you know you can't afford an idea, a creative idea, don't try to make it. If your idea is brilliant but needs more money, fight for that money to be made available, or bin that idea altogether. Either way, don't kid yourself. But don't be put off by tiny budgets. It may seem that lack of money is an excuse for not doing good ideas, because let's face it, many impressive ads are actually quite expensive to produce. But look at it this way. I had almost a zero budget to work with when I started at Aardvark Records. Financial poverty was the perfect incubator for truly innovative creative concepts, and ideas that actually cost nothing but time and effort to bring to fruition. Okay, I've told you and I have banged this into the ground about not using cliches, but I'm going to actually use one. Budget poverty really is the mother of all invention. Take note of how many great press and online advertisements and posters consist of just a few words and a logo. At the same time, if an idea is very funny or appealing, it's more likely for people to give their services free or cheaply. Sometimes a good idea often creates its own backers. There really is no limit to how much you can investigate about the various media you might use in crafting your strategic brand messages. So for instance, you can learn about photography, things like editing, lighting, film, computers, animation. You can also learn about production methods, film libraries, music search companies. Or you can learn about typography and illustration. Watch films and TV, theater and cabaret, and make a mental note of useful actors, gags, ideas to remember for future use. Remember, great copy usually comes from the copywriter's own life experiences, in other words, from life itself. You can even collect books that relate to all of the above areas, or watch lifestyle shows, things like home improvements, travel, that sort of thing. Reality TV shows like Big Brother can also provide a goldmine of audience-related information. Or you might travel to things like advertising websites, especially award annuals for D&AD, or websites like Brand Republic that are also worth their weight in gold, as are magazines and websites like Advertising Week and Marketing Week. Try unlikely sounding art exhibitions, attend film festivals, just in short, get out there. Of course, you don't need to do all of this from day one, but just adopt the habit of hoovering up information all of the time. You don't need to remember the different filters for indoor and outdoor filming. It's just a general knowledge that you're after. It's just something that sits in the back of your brain that may one day inform your work. In day-to-day work, you can probably convince yourself that you've already satisfied the whole know your audience rule very early in the process. For example, if you're writing a TV commercial aimed at middle-aged women, you could, within seconds of the brief hitting your desk, conclude, I know that target market personally. It's me mum. I just spoke to her on the telephone last night. As for researching the media, you might say something to yourself like, I watch TV all the time, so I've researched this medium too. Simplistic as it sounds, this actually isn't a bad way to think about things, as it helps bring the idea of advertising down to earth. When Richard Phillips wrote the BT character, starring Maureen Lipman for British Telecom, he was instructed to think of the target market as his own mother, and he did exactly that. It's kind of like composing an important memo for your boss's eyes only. You say something to yourself like, I know his or her foibles intimately, and I receive memos all the time, so I know which style works best. In both examples, you could go further, putting a photo of your mother on the desk as a reminder when writing copy, or phoning the boss's PA to see what kind of mood he or she is in. Both of these actions would help you carry out your task with little effort. Or you could put in a little bit more effort, say going to a research group of other people's mothers, or taking the boss's PA to lunch to canvass a likely reaction to your views, would make a further contribution to the success of your end product. The principle is, the more effort you put in, the better you will understand your task. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the classic series of BT adverts starring Maureen Lipman, or for those of you who weren't born yet, because they were a very old series of commercials, I've cued it, so it's going to play in just a couple of seconds. My best advice is to research more than you could possibly need to on the subject that you're going to be working on. And this could be your brand's sector, industry, or field, including its characteristics and the people within it. The reason is that if you research only according to your first impressions of a project, or according to your own preconceived ideas of what you'll end up with, your end product itself will be restrained by the limits of your own conformity. Force yourself to research more broadly, even if it seems wasteful, as it will inform your writing and mystify your peers as to how you came up with such a novel piece of work. The internet is a fabulous tool for research, as you'll often find that your competitors or even your client already has a website with plenty of information on it. The internet's also great for picture research, ready-made links, and obscure points of fact. Google everything. Remember what I said about thinking outside of the box. But it comes with a caution. Do be a bit wary. The net can be a false friend. Sometimes its sheer speed and its range can seem to give you an instant solution. So also consider slower forms of research if there's time. Things like the library. Now, this may sound like the sort of advice handed out in the 1940s to rookie copywriters wearing tweeds and smoking pipes, but try it once. You'll actually, you will amaze yourself. It's taking you away from your office or your home working space, and it gives you the space where you'll find the subject becomes far more real to you. It's no longer something that's just wandered into your office that needs to be wrestled out as soon as possible. In a library, you realize grown men and women have spent years of their life considering it, the subject that you're researching, or collecting data about it. On the internet, information is arranged according to someone else's agenda, and it's better in certain areas than others. And I don't fail to see the irony in that statement considering where you are, online, doing this course. However, in the library you can usually get a more rounded picture of your subject. Your own mind will become curious about some other aspects of it. A piece of copy written entirely in the office on the subject of ballpoint pens can take its raw material only from what's in your office at the time. Some notes from the manufacturer and a quick look at the product would probably lead you to start with something like, what's the best ballpoint pen you've ever had? As soon as it starts, it already reads like it's a losing battle. You're obviously trying to find an interesting angle on ballpoint pens from inside your own head. Why should there be one there? What evolutionary benefit would it have? When people say break the rules, what they often mean is come up with something fresh. The internet would furnish you with a good number of places in the world to buy a ballpoint pen, but take a stroll down to the library, and you may end up with some actual real information. Your copy might start with something like, in 1834, a man fell into a drain in Budapest, an event which led to the invention of the ballpoint pen. Or, mile for mile, the Smith & Jones ballpoint pen works out cheaper to run than a family saloon. Advertising copy like this kind of makes you feel as though you're being served fresh ingredients. Okay, so having loaded up with information, you need to seriously think about producing some ideas. However, apart from making a note of any ideas that occur spontaneously, you should otherwise hold back. The reason for this is to ensure you're saying the right thing. No matter how much talent and technique is apparent in your copywriting, at least 90% of its effectiveness resides in the message you've decided, or that you've been given, to communicate. So choose wisely and say the right thing. The first rule here is set deeply in stone, yet it's regularly transgressed. Say one thing, and one thing only. This doesn't refer to the content of body copy or to a stylistic idea, but to the underlying message. If your copy is designed to say a certain car model is safe, don't also say that it's cheap. Readers can only catch one message at a time. The particular message to be conveyed is normally presented in the form of a brief, either your own brief or one that's given to you from a client. And it's not such a bad idea, if the brief is for your own brand, to think about it like a client brief. It's a good way for you to focus. This might include the proposition or promise, along with a few words on tone of voice, audience, factual support, and various kinds of guidelines and mandatory requirements. These are things that you put on yourself. You can waste months of effort if you don't answer the brief. It's part of your task to know that the brief, it's just a piece of paper, behind which is a product and a company's history, political problems, share price problems, and competitive situation. This nebulous state of affairs is also part of your brief. I've included a sample brief for you to work on in the scenario section. Always remember that your copy links to your brand strategy, which links to your overall business strategy. Or substitute that with the word client. It always links to either your own or a client's brand strategy, which again always relates to an overall business strategy. Put another way, copy is informed by a brand communication brief, which is informed by a brand, which is informed by a business strategy. It is a continuous line. So it's time to dig a little deeper. It's always worth going through the strategic thinking process yourself. It might actually take you somewhere different than you expect. Start by answering the following questions about the copy you need to produce. What is the context? Given that context, what are you saying? Given what you're saying, what is the end line or the tagline? Think of a tagline or end line as a catchphrase or a slogan. I've already given you a few taglines already through the various units and sessions. The label that shares. We listen and we learn. Just do it. Because you're worth it. This is a slight case of brand messaging by numbers. Obviously, most brands come with a tagline already in place. But even then, it's important to consider the tagline, if only to check it's still right, and, if so, to anchor your conceptual work to it. In theory, and yes, here's another rule, all brand messages should, in some way, prove their tagline. The tagline is a rudder throughout the creative process. Unfortunately, the best taglines are such effortless little phrases that even experienced branding people often try to apply them as a cherry on a cake after the work has been done. But nail the tagline down before you write the brand message, and decades of clarity can be yours. This was the case with Aardvark Records. Be aware of the market information and circumstances that created the brief that you have to answer. Just as researching a little more about your audience can summon forth some excellent creative concepts, so too can being truly aware about the marketplace, industry, or sector either your brand or your client's brand operates within. If you're an agency person, it certainly will make selling your work a little easier. The fact that grand strategy is not part of your job description does give you at least one slight advantage over for those whom it is. You can think with objectivity about your client's predicament in a way that the chief executive may not be able to. The chief executive, he or she may converse with other highly placed personnel in the marketplace, but perhaps finds it difficult to assimilate the public's attitude from a bunch of figures in a survey. Either way, if you work for yourself or for an agency, if you follow the rules outlined in this session thus far, you'll have the background information. You have the added benefit in that it's your job now to crystallize your findings into a piece of creative work. Think of context as the who, what, why, where, and when of your brand message. Andrew Rutherford, writer of Labor Isn't Working, which was a 1979 Conservative Party poster, he was able to crystallize the prevailing UK political situation at just the moment in time when a poster was required. To put it figuratively, you need to be something of a weather balloon. You need to know which way the prevailing winds are blowing. Another famous, or infamous, depending on your sensibilities, example was the Ann Summers online campaign after the 2010 UK general election. And this is when the UK had its first coalition government for decades, pretty much within living memory. Ann Summers wanted a strategy which would drive awareness of its brand and position it as edgy with online audiences. The agency it used came up with a solution, that used innovative online media channels that attracted huge volumes of eyeballs at a relatively low cost. The agency got a bit cheeky, using the paid search mechanic, and it did it in a really clever way to put the Ann Summers brand into places you just wouldn't or didn't expect to see it. So for instance, for the election 2010 outcome, what was the tagline? What was the advertising that people saw? Visit Ann Summers and find out why we believe in a well-hung parliament. Which was followed by the infamous "There's no recession in pleasure" tagline and advert for the particularly gloomy 2010 budget announcement. The results? Ann Summers gained national media coverage from the likes of The Guardian and The Independent, resulting in something like 1.5 million impressions online, all for a campaign spend, are you waiting for it, of less than £4,500. Raise your point of view above the day-to-day pressures into the general forces that are acting on your brand and your brand's market, or your client and your client's market. Let the Ann Summers example serve as a really innovative, cheeky, funny, effective way of using what's going on within your brand environment to come up with something new and different and get your brand on people's radar. Now, if your understanding of the context is correct, what you say follows fairly naturally. Take as an example from Sugarman, Volvo, which started advertising in Britain with a range of cars that were perceived as safe, but boring. After careful thought, they decided that what they had to do was to make safety the absolute requirement for a car. As time moves on and the market context changes, things became more difficult. In the 1980s, the affluent people in their target markets, they were just no longer a cautious breed. And that's an important thing to remember. Context is never static. It does change and evolve. In the 80s, Volvo's market, well, they were all about having fun. The ads for safety were just simply enough to be award-winning, but BMW and Volkswagen, well, they were taking similar sterling qualities and expressing them as sexy engineering and quirky life enhancement, respectively. For Volvo, it was now imperative to make safety fun. This, as you can imagine, was not an easy task, and to begin with, nothing much was accomplished, as there was a need to keep advertising new models and to keep the name Volvo in the public eye. The agency they hired just didn't have time to go through the whole thought process, and there were a number of unsuccessful commercials which seemed to kind of dent the brand's image. For example, one showed a car transforming magically into a white horse, which wasn't at all the sort of solid virtue one would have expected of Volvo. And as the 90s broke, the quality of the agency and the client prevailed as someone, somewhere, wrestled with the proposition and turned it into a logical one. Safety could be fun because it means you can do more dangerous things. Despite the fact that Volvo don't use a tagline, what they're saying as an advertiser is clear. It's logically connected to their context and therefore makes some good branding messaging and for a brand that stays in good shape. Having decided on the all-motivating message, the next job is to seek the right expression. It may seem that searching for the perfect way of expressing your unique proposition to some may seem overly poetic, but this is the essence of advertising writing. It may be enough to say that your proposition in a direct, no-nonsense fashion, something like, "We sell food cheaper," for example. Now, this would work if yours was a direct, no-nonsense company which really did sell food cheaper and had no other quality to recommend it. Your tagline needs to carry what you want to say with the maximum possible distinction, but using the shortest possible numbers of words. And we do this not only to stand out from the rest, but to also stick in people's minds. Given that so few words, usually, we have to play with when coming up with taglines, you need to try permutations of words, then analyze their subtle differences in meaning to find a word or phrase that clicks. For example, saying something like, "More people prefer Smedleys." Well, that may mean the same as "the majority of people prefer Smedleys," but there are subtle differences in connotation that are almost too small to define in a literary studies class. Yet, when used in a mass communications context, the latter suggestion of recent scientific tests may be significant. So let's use a real-life example. Let's take Tesco's, for example, and their tagline, "Every little helps." Now, this clearly comes from a market imperative for cheapness, but it avoids the connotation of low quality by using a colloquial phrase rather than a direct claim along the lines of, "You can't buy any cheaper." This isn't a particularly remarkable achievement. Sainsbury's, their main rival, they'd already been running with "good food costs less" than Sainsbury's, and they've been doing it for many years. However, what the line "Every little helps" does, and does very cleverly, is address a prevailing media climate of suspicion, in which supermarkets are accused of profiteering, bad treatment of suppliers, and general exploitations. The line places itself alongside the customer, as if the company itself was suffering from exactly the same problems as the harried housewife struggling to lop off the odd penny, off the price of tomatoes. It's ingenious. Another good example that shows just how helpful a line can be is Wallace's "Dressed to Kill." And this came from Bartle, Bogle, and Hegarty. As a tagline, it's sound enough to set up some fashion press brand messages that were more enjoyable than the usual fashion ones. Finally, a tagline needn't just be a collection of mildly invigorating words at the bottom of a page, tucked beneath the logo. It can also be the idea of the advertising itself. The AA was one motoring organization among many scrabbling after memberships outside supermarkets, until someone, somewhere, elevated it to the fourth emergency service. Its branding copy and messages have never been memorable, but the idea rings out in the tagline and has been lethal in terms of kind of nicking customers from its main rivals. Now we're getting into one of my favorite subjects, tone of voice, because part of answering a brief is finding the exact tone of voice that fits the brand. Now, this is just only a section in one session about copywriting rules. It could be a course in its own right. Studies have shown that the meaning people extract from each other during conversation is about 7% down to the words we hear, and 38% based on the tone those words are said in. The remaining 55% is based largely on body language. The reason this subject is so much bigger than simply communicating product or service values to an audience is that it also impacts on the identity of the company itself. In organizations where the corporate or brand tone of voice is clearly understood, it's a positive force for a company because it helps all of its employees live the brand, as one marketing manager puts it. The benefit is a clear and intuitive understanding by all staff of the goals and approach of their organization. Wolf Olins echoes this thought in his Guide to Corporate Identity, which was published by the Design Council. The fundamental idea behind a corporate identity program is that in everything the company does, everything it owns, and everything it produces, the company should project a clear idea of what it is and what its aims are. Now, this should all be sounding familiar. A company's brand communication is the very expression of what a company does, of what it owns, and is itself a company product. There is often a great benefit in considering how your company's identity may be represented in the sort of language used and the kind of ideas expressed. Tone of voice seems very important for some reason in car advertising. We can all identify the Volkswagen tone of voice after years of consistency. One of the best examples of pure tone of voice is the long-running Economist campaign. They managed to do everything from billboards down to special offer inserts with exactly the same simple, superior tone, no matter what the subject. In turn, part of what defines and refines a tone of voice is consistency. Virgin, for example, in all of its manifestations, maintains a willful, youthful, countercultural tone of voice throughout everything it says and does, whether it's taking on British Airways in court or launching a new phone tariff. So let's delve a little bit more deeply into the whole tone of voice thing. Innocent Smoothies exists in a space all of its own making with a cunningly innocent tone of voice that's immediately recognizable, and the tone of the voice on its packaging is identical to the tone of voice that we hear on television. Or another example, the closer Audi gets to pure, steely, dramatic inscrutability in its tone of voice, the less it actually has to say. What these very different brands all have in common is that almost everything we think of them spontaneously comes from their tone of voice. Eternally useful as a great tagline is, a great corporate voice has the potential to be in some ways even more powerful. Virgin can start a company in any sector it likes because everyone will immediately recognize its role in the sector through its tone of voice. Virgin Yogurt, then. Virgin Yogurt would basically be the rock and roll version of the leading brand that breaks new ground in ways that benefits the consumer. Hard to imagine, I know. Just as having a voice rather than a line gives you flexibility to enter different markets with a ready-made identity, so it also allows you to express yourself through different media and run widely different campaigns without worrying about fragmenting what you stand for. So let's take a look at some innocent smoothie ads to see what I mean about tone of voice. Virgin Mobile ran a famous campaign using the line, "The devil makes work for idle thumbs." The line, for a start, is clearly liberated from the usual hankerings of chairmen and advertising purists in that it doesn't aspire to last forever. It's freed from the role of containing the brand statement, from having to say something like, Virgin, the phones that make you appear cooler. It can spiral off into another world where advertising isn't selling. It's a source of fascination in itself. So for Aardvark, things like Adventures in Music, Music Unlimited, and even things like The Label That Shares. To this day, they remain successful taglines for Aardvark, and have actually provided a lot of fun over the years. As is the Aardvark tone of voice, that of a cooler, older sibling, or cousin, or hip uncle or aunt. The corporate voice is a marketing property that has special skills to get through boundaries, to get around walls, fly under the radar, where a traditional approach would give itself away at the first checkpoint. It's tempting to overstate the kind of financial value of owning a unique tone of voice, but the case study of Virgin Mobile is a startling one. As I've already mentioned, on entering any market, Virgin has a ready-made, well-liked tone of voice, kind of as the people's champion, kind of on a mission to simplify and make more enjoyable the experience of using whatever Virgin product or service is being promoted. Mobile phones were ripe for simplification. A university study calculated that at the time of Virgin's entry, there were 1 million different possible tariffs on offer between the big four players in the market. Not much fun. Virgin's first campaign was aimed at communicating their inherently simple offering of one rate for everyone. The Virgin Mobile brand took off exponentially, and it built up an impressive customer base, the measure of success in the mobile phones market. The value of being able to do this from scratch is enormous, but factor in the small detail that Virgin didn't actually own any of the stuff that you make phone networks from. And it's even more impressive. Virgin didn't own any networks. There were no shops. It didn't own any mobile phone masts. It didn't own any bandwidth. They were a virtual network, simply buying the capacity they needed for their customers from another of the players in the market. Virgin's corporate voice meant they could start a £300 million brand from nothing, with nothing. Can yours do that? This is the other side of the tone of voice coin. The American drama series, 6 Feet Under, created some unforgettable spoof advertising campaigns that were used in its pilot episode. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the show itself depicted members of the Fisher family, who run a funeral home in Los Angeles, and their friends and lovers and complicated kind of lives. The series traces these characters' lives over the course of 5 years, and it serves as an example of very dark comedy, and it was very groundbreaking at the time. Now, given that a funeral home took center stage, the spoof adverts were industry-related. The spoofs were as controversial as the pilot episode itself. The controversy was centered squarely on their content. But what I think actually lays underneath all of the outcry at the time was the tone of voice used in these spoofs. The copy in the ads is actually genius. If you really sit there and listen to the copy, along with the image, it was really quite well done stuff. Not only was it genius, it was in a bizarre kind of way the ads were credible, which I think made the ads all the more unnerving and unsettling and highly effective. Light-hearted funeral commercials delivered in an upbeat, funny style, you kind of get the picture. It's the Western Judeo-Christian view of death and funerals that makes these commercials so unnerving and, to many, disturbing. By Western standards, the tone of voice jars. It's incongruent. And I've included a few of them for you to view. So watch them, really listen to the copy that accompanies them, the tone of voice, the imagery, everything. We're going to be spending some time discussing these in our next tutorial session. So to kind of wrap things up, in fact, every company has a tone of voice, whether it promotes itself or not. This is self-evidently true if you think of a company you may have phoned recently. The image you have of this company will be made up of the publicity you've seen for the company and the mood and tone of the person you happen to speak to that day. And the percentage of that impression created by the call handler is probably greater than the millions they spent on advertising in reaching you by mail shot. In fact, everything contributes to tone of voice. How you publicize your prices, the staff in a showroom, your non-smoking policy, your stationery, your speed of replying to emails, your networking skills, your company cars, your reps' hairstyles, your managing director's quotes in the local paper, your coffee machines, your invoices, the way you treat your suppliers, your lifts. They all communicate. And Virgin knows this. Gap knows this. Innocent and Audi know this. Their cultures will pervade every part of the experience of visiting a Virgin, Gap, or Audi premises. Most universities, record labels, media companies, film companies, banking companies, utility providers, they don't seem to understand this, which is odd given the hundreds of millions of pounds spent on their branding messages. One difference to be aware of is that between a trained voice and an untrained one. The untrained voice is typically raw. It has a sense of immediacy about it. And sometimes it's devastatingly successful. The in-house advertising departments of EasyJet, Gap, and Benetton all have, or had at some point, colossal cut-through to the collective consciousness, as it were. But Bernard Matthews always strikes me as the quintessentially untrained marketing voice. You rarely see him these days, at least not on the small screen. But the fortune that presumably allows him to stay away from the small screen was built up from some highly derided commercials some decades ago. And some of you will remember those adverts where he bragged of his turkey firm's white meat with no professional help whatsoever. It's hard now to buy his turkey Twizzlers without still hearing some of his gum-booted vowels in that distance. The point is that, just as a trained, youth-focused rock and roll tone of voice was trusted by young purchasers of mobile phones, a simple, untrained farmer's tone of voice was trusted by mums for meat products. The reason tone of voice can be so powerful is that it's the final leap of contraction. Once you've reduced a brand's offering to a few words, a proposition, mantra, tagline, or whatever it might be, to reduce it one step more to a voice or an attitude is to become real and trusted to the target market, with all the pleasant, long-term consequences that implies. You really are in a position to write traditional brand copy. You know the background of copywriting. You know who you're talking to. You have information from the brief about the current imperatives and the direction you're traveling. The final pieces of the puzzle, they merely provide finesse. If you produce ideas using research into these areas, your ideas will be relevant. Other areas might strike you as interesting or fashionable, but whatever you write has to be there for a reason. Don't put things in on a personal whim, for example, because you find it funny, or you saw it on the telly last night. Nor should you try to steer your copy around so you can fit in a particular joke or clever form of words. Nor should you put things in just to fill up space or time. If you feel you are, either change the length requirement or change the idea to one suitable to the time and space you're working to. Likewise, if you're working in print and you feel you're rambling on, donate that space to a picture, or even to the surrounding white space. This is where the expression less is more actually means something. The more you leave out, the more important the remainder appears, and the more powerful it looks on a page, or a flyer, or a poster. Some things that seem obviously relevant should still be left out because they're redundant. Avoid saying the same thing in words as you're saying in the pictures. If you're saying something like, "This dog collects sticks," and showing a dog, well, there's some redundancy. Show a dog and say, "Wilberforce is a collector of sticks." And there's something going on between the words and the picture that's more involving. Check the ticket of every fact you include. Does it have a right to be there? Or is it there just because that's the way it's always done? Is it an important part of the product? Even if it is it an important part of the reason to buy the product? However, with all this avoiding and getting rid of, you could end up with nothing at all. If you get rid of everything that's not relevant to your target market and you're left with nothing, well, that should kind of tell you something very important about your brief. However, to be more positive, how do you find what's relevant? Well, often it's right there in front of you, looking absolutely boring and unusable. And this point takes us back to our previous session when I gave you examples like Kalel or Little Spitfire that address just this same thing. When you consider the creative alternatives, it may seem that to bed your idea in reality is boring. However, you don't gain much by using clever comparison. The clever comparisons that do work often turn out on further examination to be not so fanciful after all. If you're clever for cleverness' sake, you risk confusing and ultimately losing your audience. Risk a joke and risk that they won't get it. Essentially, the rule "be relevant" concerns communication. This needs to be said because you can follow all of the rules perfectly. You can actually produce fabulous poetry on behalf of your own brand or the brand of your client, but it won't be good copy. Communication is a very special concept because it combines the idea of a message sent with a message received. To make the point, draw a blob on a piece of paper. That blob is you. You have a history, a background, a state of mind, a set of ambitions. It's also your company, with its history, background, present situation, and set of goals. But it's also your client, and their history, background, problems, and goals. That blob now contains your entire professional universe, and it's very small. Now draw another blob on the same piece of paper to represent the person you're talking to. He or she's not interested in your career or the company that you speak for. You could put everything together logically and perfectly, and he or she would just ignore it. Why? Because he or she also has a history, a background, a state of mind, and a set of goals and ambitions, enough to fill up his or her own life without any input from you, your company. And believe it or not, Your client could disappear forever, and this person wouldn't care. If they did care, why would we be asked to promote to them? In a situation where people don't care, you need to find a point of contact. In terms of the two blobs on your page, it draws an X on the page between them. It creates something that's visible and meaningful for both parties. As the writer of many of Apple's greatest ads, Steve Hayden puts it, search for some way to relate the tiny, constricted world the clients live in to the larger, sunnier world people actually care about. This is what you're looking for. In the words of Zen in The Art of Alchemy, you must think from the point of view of the archer and the target at the same moment. Or to put it less profoundly, you need a branding copy idea. Facts speaking for themselves are very convincing. You can't always stick cars to posters, but you can embody proof in everything that you write. An example of this is advertising agency DDB's snowplow commercial for Volkswagen. We open on a VW Beetle driving through the thick snow in a very early dawn. It arrives at a shed. Meanwhile, a male voiceover says, "Have you ever wondered how the man who drives the snowplow gets to the snowplow?" We then see a man's feet get out of the car and trudge to a larger vehicle, and the voiceover continues. This one drives a Volkswagen, so you can stop wondering. It's a beautifully simple advertising idea, bedded in reality, that exudes self-evident proof of the reliability of the car, even though on closer examination there's no actual proof there. And here's the video. On the screen are the key takeaways from this part of Session 3. Feel free to pause the video, go through them, either jot them down if you like, but I invite you to kind of really think about what each one of those means to you and your understanding of them before we progress on to the second half of this session.